Before I begin discussing my research, I'd like to begin with a statement that guides my life and has guided this entire dissertation, my higher purpose statement. This purpose statement serves as the grounding mission for this dissertation. It shapes not only who I am as a researcher, but also my methodology and the direction I took in this study. When I was lost or had doubts about any aspect of my research, I turned to this statement for guidance. My higher purpose is to restore the kinship worldview, honoring the interconnectedness and balance of all life, and guiding spiritual seekers towards soul-centric ways for wellness. To understand how I devised my higher purpose statement, I invite you to read my book, Stuck in Yesterday, Visionary Practices for Building a Purposeful Future, released earlier this year. This dissertation is a response to a serious problem. In Lost Connections, Johann Hari argues that many of today's struggles with anxiety and depression are rooted not simply in biology, but in profound forms of disconnection. Disconnection from meaningful values, from community, from the natural world, and even from ourselves, revealing deeper social, cultural, and spiritual layers that cause modern distress. I believe Indigenous knowledge offers an important antidote to this systemic challenge. I'm a member of the Quechua Nation and a child of the Quechua Bolivian diaspora, currently living in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm an author and a professor of college writing and literature at Northern Virginia Community College. One of the gaps that I see in the contemporary wellness industry is that wellness is limited to ideas that prioritize physical appearance, consumerism, and youth, while giving less attention to restoring our relationships with community, with the natural world, with spirit, and with the more than human beings whom Indigenous traditions recognize as our relatives. My dissertation seeks to help repair this challenge by exploring Indigenous wellness principles that restore connection rather than simply reduce distress. So, drawing from Quechua and Tantric traditions, this study explores 3 Indigenous wellness principles that reflect what Four Arrows and Darcia Narvaez describe as a kin-centric worldview: kinship alliances, ethical guidelines, and embodied learning and practice. These principles involve ethical living, ritual, ceremony, expanded kinship beyond human relationships, and lived spiritual practice for supporting holistic wellness across the personal, relational, and spiritual dimensions of life. Ultimately, my goal is that this research contributes not only to Indigenous scholarship, but also provides people suffering from anxiety and depression and other emerging visionary practitioners with practical, culturally respectful pathways toward a more connected and sustaining way of living through Indigenous wisdom. To explain why this research is important to me, I'd like to share the story that brought me to this work, my origins. Although I was born in Arlington, Virginia, and raised throughout Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., my family story begins in the Andes Mountains of Bolivia and Peru. My parents immigrated from Bolivia to the United States in the early 1980s, and like many children of immigrants, I grew up feeling connected to my family's Bolivian heritage, but largely disconnected from the Indigenous traditions that had shaped it. As an adolescent into my late teenage years, I identified as an atheist and was largely disconnected from the spiritual traditions of my ancestral lineage. My immersion into Indigenous wellness practices would not begin till I was 17 years old, while I was traveling on a bus from Washington, D.C. to Yellow Springs, Ohio, where I was headed for an admissions interview at Antioch College. During the overnight ride, I sat next to a man who spent most of the trip quietly reading. The following morning, I finally struck up a conversation by offering him some snacks. He smiled and gently declined, saying, "I can't take food right now. I haven't done my meditation yet." I'm a monk. That response struck a deep chord in me. As we talked, I shared my hopes about attending college, shared my essay and songs that I'd written to share at my interview. He listened with genuine warmth, and before we parted, he asked for my mailing address and invited me to attend a meditation retreat in Missouri. I can't say that I would have gone for sure without what happened next. A few weeks later, a package arrived in the mail. Inside was a book on tantric meditation, a CD of kirtan music, information about the retreat, and contact information for a local meditation teacher. I was so moved by this kindness and generosity of this monk, who I'd only met once on a bus. More than 20 years later, I still see that encounter with Acharya Dada Gananathananda Avaduta as one of the main catalysts that awakened my spiritual path. Now, despite several obstacles, I eventually attended the retreat in Missouri. There, I learned tantric meditation and was initiated into a broader spiritual framework centered on cultivating a deep relationship with the Supreme Consciousness and the teachings of the Guru Sri Sri Anandamurti. Although Tantra was not part of my ancestral lineage, it became my first sustained experience with an indigenous informed spiritual system. In my dissertation, I thoroughly explain why and how Anandamurti positioned Tantra to be the indigenous tradition of the original inhabitants of India. But I won't be going into those details in this presentation. Antioch and the expansion of my journey. When I arrived at Antioch College, another important mentor entered my life. Dr. Ann Philmeyer. She became not only my academic advisor, but also one of my spiritual mentors. Through Ann, I participated in my first sweat lodge ceremony in the Anishinaabeg tradition. That ceremony was rooted in the teachings of grandmother Kiwe Dinokwe, the Ojibwe Anishinaabe Mashkikikwe elder, whose teachings also informed this dissertation and provide important insights into indigenous wellness principles and practices. Later, Anne became the chair of my dissertation committee. The continuity of mentorship has profoundly enriched both my personal journey and this dissertation study. While I was at Antioch, I made my first pilgrimage to Peru, completing a 4-day Inca trail trek to Machu Picchu and visiting many sacred sites in the Andes Mountains. That pilgrimage marked the beginning of my reconnection with my Andean ancestry. At that point, I knew I had indigenous ancestry, but I didn't yet understand what it meant. When I returned to the United States, however, I did not have access to teachers within the Andean tradition. Because of that, I continued my spiritual development within the tantric lineage of Sri Sri Anandamurti under the guidance of Acharya Dada Vishvarupananda Avaduta, who taught me meditation and continues to be my mentors until this day. Anandamurti's organization is called Ananda Marga, and my involvement in the organization grew into a huge commitment from my part to spiritual education and community building for the organization, becoming a spiritual teacher. In 2016, I launched a YouTube channel originally called Tantra Thoughts. Over time, it grew to more than 20,000 subscribers and became a platform for sharing tantric philosophy and practice. Alongside that work, I facilitated weekly collective meditations for more than 10 years. I led online meditations every Saturday for 3 years through an organization I founded called Vistara Circle. Everything I did during that period was motivated by a desire to create accessible opportunities for spiritual practice, community building, and for people to learn the teachings of Sri Sri Anandamurti, which had been transformative in my journey. I organized retreats, trainings, and community learning experiences. One milestone that was especially meaningful to me was developing and co-teaching a 200-hour Tantra Yoga teacher training between 2017 and 2018, offered in collaboration with my teacher, Dada Vishvarupananda. Then in 2018, I traveled to Bokaro, India, at the invitation of senior Indian acharyas to participate in Tattvika training, philosophy mastery training within the Anandamarga tradition. This advanced philosophical training prepares practitioners to become family acharyas, who are non-monastic teachers within Anandamarga. Although I was not designated as a family acharya after the training, because at the time, candidates were required to be parents, and I was not a parent yet, the experience significantly deepened both my practice and my development as an educator of tantric teachings. Throughout those years, one question continued to emerge in my work. How can people in Western contexts learn and integrate the teachings of indigenous and other non-Western spiritual traditions effectively and respectfully? A glimpse into those findings will be shared later in this presentation. Returning to my ancestors. I began this doctoral program in 2022. Immediately following the first residency, I traveled to Bolivia with my family to spend time with relatives and with a renewed goal of tracing my ancestral roots. One of the most meaningful experiences during that visit was organizing a conversation with my mother and several of my aunts and uncles to better understand our indigenous ancestry and why so much of it had been lost within our family. During that conversation, my uncle Javier, a retired professor of economics in Bolivia, explained that our family is Quechua. He also admitted that my grandmother's generation intentionally chose not to teach the Quechua language or pass on many of the traditions to my parents' generation because it was believed that assimilation offered the best chance for survival and opportunity in modern post-colonial times. That decision was an affirmation of the colonial conquest that had displaced indigenous cultures and teachings. My uncle's frank explanation took on more clarity as I began studying with my Quechua elders in Peru in 2023, who are members of the Tito Kuntor Cosnipa Kanchi Quechua lineage from Pumacanchi, Peru. Many of them, who are not that much older than me, share that they did not learn Spanish until they were 15 or 16 years old and had moved to the city of Cusco. In the city, they avoided speaking Quechua in public spaces because they feared being ridiculed or treated differently. Hearing those stories helped me better understand the historical forces that had shaped both my family's experience in Bolivia and the broader realities facing indigenous communities throughout the Andes. Between 2022 and 2025, I returned to the Andes multiple times, primarily to Peru, for retreats and trainings to begin an apprenticeship as a Yachacha Pampa Paco, a Quechua shaman of wisdom, with Tupac Tito Kuntor, a Kanchi Quechua elder who lives in Pumacanchi, Peru. I was connected to Tupac through Dr. Carol Parker. She was truly the source of much of what I was able to accomplish in this project, because she introduced me to almost everyone that was involved in my project, from my new teachers to my co-facilitators up to my research participants. The decision to focus my research on Quechua insights for wellness was also influenced by another member of my dissertation committee, and that was Dr. Greg Cajete from the Tewa Nation, who lives in Santa Clara, Pueblo. He would serve as the reader and research consultant on my dissertation committee. When I first began the program, I thought I would center my research on wellness insights from a variety of indigenous traditions, comparing them to tantric teachings. But Dr. Cajete advised that the inquiry begin with the teachings of my own Quechua lineage. Obviously, that guidance not only helped to expand my spiritual life, but also gave this research so much more personal cultural significance. So I want to acknowledge the contributions of all three of my dissertation committee members, Dr. Ann Philmeyer, Dr. Carol Parker, and Dr. Greg Cajete, Their mentorship, wisdom, and support truly exemplify the deeply relational nature of Indigenous research, and their influence is deeply woven throughout every aspect of this project. My positionality. The story I just shared provides the context for my positionality as a researcher. As Linda Tuiwai Smith describes, I fit the position of an insider research, meaning I'm not studying Quechua knowledge from the outside. I'm not just a researcher, I'm a practitioner of the cultural and epistemological traditions this dissertation explores. My role as a Paco carries an ongoing responsibility to my elders, my ancestors, and my lineage to represent these teachings with integrity and respect. At the same time, more than 2 decades of tantric practice provides me with deep familiarity of a second indigenous knowledge tradition. I spent so much of my life immersed within the tantric worldview that I can't help but recognize any philosophical resonances across cultures with the tantric teachings of Anandamurti. Of course, within this tradition, I'm also accountable to my teachers and Anandamurti's lineage. In addition, I stand within Western academia. My experience as a college professor, going back 20 years now, has shaped my ability to communicate Indigenous knowledge in ways that are accessible to Western pedagogical standards, while striving to preserve its original cultural context. So rather than seeing these identities as separate, I understand them as interconnected. They position me as a bridge between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems. That position offers important strengths, including lived experience, relational accountability, the ability to translate across worldviews. At the same time, it requires continual reflection on questions of authority, representation, and the ethical sharing of Indigenous knowledge. These relationships and positionality ultimately shaped every aspect of my research process and methodology, which I will discuss next. Research questions and sub-questions. At the heart of my study is one central question. What Indigenous principles and related practices can help people in Western and non-Western contexts attain better wellness? As I explored this larger question, several important sub-questions help to extract deeper information. What does wellness mean in the modern world and in a purely Indigenous context? Why are Indigenous teachings and related practices important for wellness in the modern world? What are some Quechua and Tantric practices for wellness? What are the benefits of bringing Quechua and Tantric teachings together? Why are ethical guidelines essential to maintain when practicing Indigenous wellness-based techniques? What teachings and learnings and strategies support the long-term integration of Indigenous wellness practices for novice practitioners? These questions seek to find solutions. In a world where many people experience disconnection from themselves, from one another, and from nature, I'm interested in knowing what Indigenous wisdom traditions can offer as pathways to connection and balance. Methodology. Before I adopted Indigenous methodology for my research, I first had to understand what it actually means to conduct research from an Indigenous perspective. One of the scholars who most influenced my thinking was Sean Wilson. In his work, Research is Ceremony, he makes an important distinction between simply doing research about Indigenous peoples and conducting research from within an Indigenous paradigm. He argues that Indigenous scholars should move beyond bringing an Indigenous perspective into conventional research and instead ground the entire research process within Indigenous ways of knowing. That distinction became liberating for me. It gave me permission not to simply study Indigenous wellness practices. Rather, I wanted to conduct the research using Indigenous methods and knowledge. Margaret Kovac further shaped my thinking by emphasizing that Indigenous research and Indigenous methodology are not the same thing. Research about Indigenous peoples does not automatically become Indigenous research. An Indigenous methodology is grounded in Indigenous epistemology. It asks different kinds of questions, values non-Western ways of knowing, and understands knowledge as something that emerges through relationship rather than detached observation. These scholars challenged me to ask not only what am I studying, but how am I studying it? And who does this research serve? Those questions ultimately led me to design a study that prioritizes relational accountability, experiential learning, and reciprocity rather than extraction or objectivity. My fieldwork research phases. My fieldwork unfolded in 3 phases between May and June of 2025. The first phase was a kinship camp inspired by Dr. Joseph Gaughan's work with culture camps, which he describes as retreats designed for Indigenous people to be immersed in traditional ways for weeks at a time to improve Indigenous people's wellness. The kinship camp in this study took on that intention, but was not exclusive to Indigenous people. It was held in Pumacanchi, Peru. The camp was led by my lineage elder and apprenticeship mentor, Paco Altomisayok Tupac Tito Kuntur. 5 participants voluntarily agreed to contribute to the research, including Dr. Parker, through post-camp reflective surveys. During this experience, I served solely as the researcher. I was neither a participant nor a facilitator, providing me an opportunity to simply be a remote observer. The camp focused on ceremony, kinship exploration, and immersive learning of Andean lifeways. The second phase was a 5-day pilgrimage to Machu Picchu along the Salcantay Trail. Here my role shifted. I participated in the pilgrimage, while also served as a co-facilitator alongside fellow Pampa Paco and trekking guide Huayra Eloy Quespe Corua of the Quechua Nation, who lives in Cusco, Peru. One participant consented to joining the pilgrimage, participant Jorgos, which was designed to explore how Quechua and Tantric teachings could be brought together in dialogue, improving the wellness of participants. The final phase was my apprenticeship, a one-on-one 5-day training with Tupac Tito Kuntur. In this phase, I was the only participant and was not serving as a facilitator. This experience continued my formal Paco training, while also providing an important source of research data. Knowledge was transmitted through the traditional teacher-student relationship that is central to Indigenous lineages. Across all 3 research phases, Indigenous wisdom keepers guided the experiences, ensuring that all teachings were shared with permission, cultural integrity, and in accordance with Indigenous protocols. To gather my data, participants completed reflective surveys after both the kinship camp and the pilgrimage using a secure password-protected Google form. During the pilgrimage, I also facilitated an audio recording sharing circle, which allowed participants to collectively reflect on reflections, their experiences while they were still immersed in the place. In addition to collecting participant reflections, I engaged in daily analytical memoing throughout both the pilgrimage and my apprenticeship. These journals documented teachings, dreams, ceremonies, realizations, and moments of knowledge transmission. Now my analysis and coding. About 4 weeks after all 3 research experiences were finished, I began my first cycle of thematic coding. The entire sense-making process, including first and second cycle coding, thematic clustering, pattern identification, was completed within approximately 5 months. My first round of analysis followed a fairly traditional qualitative coding process. At this stage, I intentionally wanted to work through a more linear and systematic way because I wanted to become familiar with the data before moving into more interpretive forms of sense-making. Also at this point, my research was still organized around what I originally believed would become 5 Indigenous teachings for wellness. I did not yet realize that those 5 teachings would become synthesized into just 3 indigenous principles. One of the most exciting parts of this first cycle was discovering insights that I had not anticipated before entering the field. One important realization was that much of the wellness participants were experiencing a restoration with nature, restoring their relationships with nature. And Dr. Ann Fillmeyer helped me connect these observations with the field of ecopsychology, as she was the former director of the ecotherapy certificate program at Southwestern College. The second cycle of analysis marked a significant shift. Instead of continuing with a primarily linear coding process, I moved toward a more reflective and ceremonial form of sense-making. Following the guidance of Dr. Cajete and Dr. Fillmeyer, I created a mandala to help me visualize the relationships emerging from the data. Based on this mandala, I based the mandala on the arrangements and placements of stones inside the Quechua Cuya quipus, the sacred bundles of healing stones. The mandala's circular design allowed me to see the research as an interconnected whole. I placed the original 5 indigenous teachings I was curating for this study within the mandala, alongside the 2 additional themes that had emerged organically during analysis. Those were nature-based wellness practices and spiritual pedagogy. As shown in this picture, creating this mandala allowed me to step back from individual codes and begin seeing how the themes related to one another. I began recognizing relationships among them. This shift ultimately led me to reorganize the findings into simply 3 broader indigenous principles for wellness: kinship alliances, ethical guidelines, and embodied learning and practice. Now, the 3 indigenous wellness principles. Let's break down the 3 principles. The first principle is kinship alliances. This principle emerged as the heart of the entire study. Dr. Greg Cajete has often emphasized relationships are at the center of indigenous ways of knowing. My findings strongly support that understanding. Participants consistently describe wellness as occurring through relationships with other people, with teachers and elders, with sacred places, with animals, with mountains, with sacred stones, and with spirit. This principle says, wellness is not something people achieve alone. It is experienced through entering reciprocal relationship with a much larger community of human and more than human relatives. The second principle is ethical guidelines. Across this study, participants discovered that transformation was supported by ethical ways of being. Quechua and tantric practices such as Aini, the yamas and niyamas, the 10 ethical guidelines of yoga, were not presented nor experienced as rules or restrictions. Instead, they became pathways for creating harmony within oneself and with others. The data suggests that ethical living is not separate from wellness. Rather, it is one of its foundations. Embodied learning and practice. This third principle emphasizes that transformation occurs not solely through intellectual understanding, but through disciplined practice, ritual participation, and bodily engagement with sacred knowledge. It calls for spiritual knowledge to be integrated through embodied practice. Many indigenous practices such as pilgrimage, ceremony, meditation, yoga postures, despachos, carrying cuyas, and understanding the philosophy behind them became meaningful because they are lived with the body, the emotions, and the soul. These 3 indigenous principles offer an alternative framework for wellness based in indigenous science for modern society. While these principles emerge from my experiences within Quechua and Tantric lineages, I believe they also reflect broader patterns found across many indigenous traditions. As Dr. Greg Cajete describes, principles are living processes rather than fixed doctrines. Likewise, Dr. Fillmeyer reminds us that principles represent underlying worldviews that different indigenous peoples express through different practices. The practices may vary across cultures, but the underlying principles often remain remarkably similar. Let me share the highlights from the findings chapter. Across the research phases, participants learned several indigenous wellness techniques that supported their understanding of kinship alliances, ethical guidelines, and embodied learning and practice. They're too numerous to share here today, but they are all mentioned in the literature review and the findings and discussion chapter of the dissertation. I hope you will read it one day. Here I will just touch on a few Quechua and Tantric teachings and practices. I will present these to you within their assigned Indigenous wellness principle category. I will first explain the embodied philosophy behind them, and then the embodied way they were practiced during the fieldwork. So under the broader category of kinship alliances, participants explored kinship with kuyas and the bath mantra practice. Kinship with kuyas. Kuyas are special kinds of sacred stones, holding a higher vibration for healing and spiritual growth. During the pilgrimage to Machu Picchu phase, participants engaged with their kuyas in innovative ways that integrated tantric practices. Each morning before breakfast, participants gathered for a 30-minute yoga practice, often facing a sacred biome being within the surrounding place field. These yoga sequences were focused on strengthening and balancing the nyawis and chakras, points of energy within the body in both the Quechua and Tantric tradition. Between postures, participants placed their kuya bundles on specific nyawis and chakras to deepen energetic awareness and support balance within these 3 points. Waida, the co-facilitator, also participated enthusiastically in these morning practices. During the recorded sharing circle, reflecting on the integration of kuyas with yogic postures, Waida shared, "Lovely, thanks hermano, and not forgetting our daily morning practice. That's been so helpful, so grounding, so strong for working with our kuyas each morning. Sometimes we work with them, but never in this way. Now we're integrating them more deeply." Waida endorsed the practice and enjoyed the combination of Tantric and Quechua elements being applied in this way. His comments also suggest that the integration of these traditions open new possibilities even for experienced practitioners within the Andean lineage. Bath mantra. Water, for many indigenous traditions, is a kinship ecology known to be the source of life. The bath mantra practice taught by Sri Sri Anandamurti honors kinship with 3 kinship ecologies: ancestors, rishis, who are the sages and scientists of the past, and water. The ritual pairs water with ancestry, reflecting the flow of life we descend from. By invoking the rishis, the practice further positions water as a guide, an element through which wisdom flows. Anandamurti said, "The great civilizations developed as they moved along rivers from the mountains to the sea, through the hilly stages, plain stages, and delta stages. These civilizations finally only bloomed in the delta stage, where the rivers end in the ocean." During the pilgrimage, I invited participants to practice the bath mantra, though I adapted it by inviting participants to practice it without the presence of water, as is traditionally done, and honor not only ancestors and rishis, but also an additional kinship alliance that was meaningful to each participant. So Waida chose to honor Inti Taita, father-son. Participant Jorgos chose to honor the owl, an animal guide he discovered during a previous Vision Quest experience. Participant Jorgos reflected that this experience helped him understand that respectfully engaging another spiritual tradition is possible when it is approached with humility, gratitude, reciprocity, and relational accountability rather than cultural consumption. This practice showed how tantric practices can be conducted in Quechua settings while also integrating Quechua elements. Under the broader category of ethical guidelines, participants engaged in the practice of Aini and Shaucha. Aini is a core ethical principle in the Quechua worldview that means reciprocity. Before colonialism, the Andean people did not have monetary currency. The way they exchanged goods and services was through Aini, reciprocity, or a bartering system based on trade for mutual benefit. Reciprocity extends beyond human exchange, to include reciprocal relationships with more than human beings and the spiritual forces that sustain life. Kinship camp participants coming from the United States were encouraged to practice Aini under the guidance of participant Dr. Parker. In her survey response, participant Dr. Parker shared, "I find that I have to teach new participants about reciprocity and respect because we tend, as Westerners, to be entitled and unconscious about these important guidelines, not only with Indigenous peoples, but amongst ourselves. I spend a lot of time providing guidelines about keeping your heart open and your pocketbook open. Be generous with tips for all the helpers and teachers. Let the teachings come into your heart and openly express your gratitude. Give honor to the ancestral lineage from which this wisdom comes. Give thanks and offerings to Pachamama every day." Shaucha. Shaucha is one of the yamas and niyamas, which are the 10 ethical guidelines of yoga. Shaucha is the practice of maintaining bodily and mental cleanliness in the tantric tradition. The opening waterfall cleansing at the beginning of the pilgrimage offered participants a new way of understanding and practicing shaucha. This involved a purification ritual beneath the waterfall at Killarumiyok, conducted by Waira. In my journal, I wrote, "We started with a cleansing. Waira was so gracious. He took both of us, Jorgos and me, to the waterfall, and he cleansed us, our mouths, our ears, cleansing what we say, what we listen to, how we use our hands and our bodies. We started in a way that said, let's make sure we are as pure and grounded as we can be. This ceremonial healing and cleansing ritual broadened the concept of shaucha from an ethical principle into an embodied relational practice rooted in local Quechua culture and guided through Quechua ceremonial tradition. Under the broader category of embodied learning and practice, participants engaged in pranayama, breathing in kausai, despachos, and the Guru Puja ritual. Pranayama is a yogic practice that means breath control. During the pilgrimage, I introduced the pranayama meditation that I had originally learned from my tantric meditation teacher, Dada Vishvarupananda. Prana means life force or breath, and yama means control. In Quechua, prana or life force can be translated as kausai. Kausai is the life force alive in everything, providing vital energy. When we arrived at Machu Picchu during the pilgrimage, Waira guided us into a cave within the temple complex that was off limits to visitors. We entered this restricted area thanks to Waira's connections and friendship he developed with security guards throughout his many years leading treks to Machu Picchu. Within this sacred setting, I invited participants to breathe in the kausai, or prana, from the surrounding apus, mountain guardians, and from the temple itself. In my journal, I wrote, "The three of us sat in the lower cave near the Temple of the Condor, and we did a pranayama meditation, which I facilitated. I explained what pranayama, prana, and kausai means to the group. I invited us to breathe into the munai, heart nyawi, all of the kausai or prana we could absorb from all the 10 apus that surround Machu Picchu and from the temple itself, and hold all of that life force into our hearts by holding our breath as long as we could. Then, as we exhaled, we offered our gratitude back to the apus and the temple. We did it 7 times. This was truly a wonderful experience, getting to do it from a cave inside the temple. For me, this became an example of how an established tantric meditation technique could be respectfully adapted within an Andean ceremonial context while honoring the worldview of both traditions. Despachos. Despacho, or jaiwaricus in Quechua, are traditional offerings practiced in the Andes for a number of different occasions. Despachos are offerings done for healing, for manifestation, to embellish and empower prayers, or for creating new agreements with oneself and Pachamama. Prayers or intentions are invoked traditionally in sets of coca leaves called quintus. Quintus can include sets of 3 or 4 leaves each, and there can be dozens of quintus offered in the despacho, depending on the practitioner, with dozens of intentions if desired. Through one's intentions, the despacho can serve to create or consecrate a new flow, path, or occasion in one's life. The offering is made to Pachamama or a sacred biome being, such as an apu. My apprenticeship generated important new understandings of despachos, showing me how to prepare the traditional quintu haiwarikui, the oldest form of despacho known. My teachers also shared additional history, symbolism, and knowledge about the ceremonial preparation. Guru Puja. Guru Puja functions as a daily devotional offering that in some way parallels the Quechua despacho ceremony in both form and intention. While despachos are often elaborate, embodied, earth-based offerings made to Pachamama or the Apus, Guru Puja is a concise, psychic version performed at the close of meditation. Both practices serve as technologies of devotion, reciprocity, and release, offering practitioners a structured way to place their intentions, burdens, and gratitude into the hands of spirit. As pilgrimage participants encountered emotional challenges along the trek, which is common for a Quechua pilgrimage that involves detoxing from city life, I introduced the tantric practice of Guru Puja as a complementary method for releasing stored emotional baggage, or samskaras. This became another example of how the two traditions could work together to support healing without replacing one another. We practice Guru Puja at Umantay Lagoon, offering our mental flowers into her water with the intention of releasing emotional baggage. At Apu Salcantay, we offered a despacho, also in part to help us shed emotional baggage that no longer served us. Through these examples of embodied learning and practices that were shared across the 3 research phases, I hope you've gotten a glimpse of how Quechua and tantric traditions can enter into respectful dialogue, generating new possibilities for wellness while remaining grounded in respect and accountability to the communities from which these teachings originate. Now, here are just some surprise findings related to spiritual pedagogy techniques. I felt these contributed to participants' understanding of the wellness principles. Number 1, entering an indigenous cosmology is most effective when participants are introduced to teachers and programs through trusted relationships and recommendations, fostering openness, safety, and receptivity to unfamiliar teachings. 2, providing an intentional orientation to the indigenous kinship worldview first helps participants recognize nature as living relatives rather than scenery, making indigenous wellness practices better understood within their cultural context and easier to integrate. 3, sharing the facilitator's personal spiritual journey builds trust, demonstrates authentic growth, and creates a relational bridge that makes unfamiliar indigenous worldviews more accessible. 4, situating indigenous spiritual practices within their historical, political, and colonial context deepens participants' appreciation for indigenous resilience while fostering ethical engagement, relational responsibility, and cultural respect. 5, beginning the pilgrimage or a new learning journey with ceremonial cleansing and ethical commitments reinforces that indigenous spiritual practice is grounded in purification, intentionality, and non-harming, preparing participants to enter sacred relationships with integrity. While these spiritual pedagogical techniques require further refinement as a spiritual teacher and connector, these insights have become a truly meaningful outcome of the dissertation to help me continue doing my work. As I conclude, I'd like to look to the future. While this dissertation has answered many of my research questions, it has also revealed new paths of inquiry. I hope to continue refining these indigenous wellness principles through future pilgrimages, kinship camps, and apprenticeship experiences, beginning in 2027. And you are all invited to join me on that journey. I also hope to carry this work beyond academia by transforming this research into a book that makes these Indigenous wellness principles more accessible to a broader audience. Above all, my deepest hope is that this work contributes in some small way to healing the disconnections of modern life by inviting people back into relationship with themselves, with one another, with Indigenous wisdom, and with the more than human world. Thank you so much to my teachers, my committee, my participants, my family, and all those who made this journey possible. Anyay and namaskar. Thank you.